I'm understanding this correctly. The mainstream media, the proud defenders of the unprofitable business of women's basketball, the mainstream media who has spent years trying to convince us that women's basketball is must-see TV instead of what it actually is, which is get off my TV. You mean to tell me the media is publicly admitting that Unrivaled is struggling?
Here's where the shift becomes impossible to ignore. The very same media voices that once treated every women's basketball project as untouchable are now openly questioning whether Unrivaled is already drifting toward irrelevance or worse, collapse. That is a stunning tonal change. These aren't fringe critics or hostile commentators. These are insiders, longtime supporters, people who once dismissed skepticism outright. When voices like that start expressing doubt, it signals that the internal consensus has broken. Media doesn't change tone without reason, especially not when it has invested years into a narrative. When it does, it's usually because the cost of defending that narrative has become higher than the cost of abandoning it. The subtlety of the shift is intentional. The language is cautious. Words like concern, questions, and uncertainty replace past certainty. But the implication is clear. Confidence is gone. And once confidence erodes, momentum follows. This moment should force everyone paying attention to pause. Because if the most loyal defenders are stepping back, it means the underlying problems are far deeper than publicly acknowledged.
Earlier today, this morning in fact, I dropped a video about Unrivaled ratings being straight trash. I mean complete dog shiznit, right? And they are. They've fallen off a cliff. Now, something I did not mention, the ratings have went down versus last year, despite there being a new television rating system that has, as we've seen, artificially inflated numbers versus previous years, and the numbers are still way down.
What makes the situation truly unprecedented is how completely the traditional media playbook has been abandoned. Historically, women's basketball projects received overwhelmingly positive coverage regardless of results. Mediocre performance was reframed as historic progress. Small wins were magnified into cultural milestones. That approach is gone. Instead, the narrative is finally aligning with observable reality. Attendance struggles are acknowledged. Viewership limitations are discussed openly. Financial sustainability is questioned. And shockingly, facts are being allowed into the conversation. Just a year ago, the messaging couldn't have been more different. Unrivaled was portrayed as the future of sports. Headlines promised domination. Commentary hyped transformative viewership numbers that would change everything. That fantasy has now collapsed. What's being quietly admitted is what many observers recognized from the beginning. Interest in women's basketball remains extremely limited at scale. Not non-existent, but nowhere near what was promised. That realization feels brutal only because it collides with years of exaggerated expectations. The disappointment isn't about failure, it's about the collapse of a story built on optimism rather than evidence. Reality didn't suddenly change. The narrative did. And once narratives fall apart, they rarely get rebuilt the same way again.
This isn't the woke media that I know to be completely useless. This isn't the media that has a long history of polishing the turd. This is unprecedented. The media is actually telling us the truth. Last year, they were trying to convince us that Unrivaled was taking over the world. Have you seen these ratings? I haven't seen ratings.
What makes this moment even more revealing is who is now delivering the criticism. This is the same media infrastructure that spent years insisting women's basketball deserved full, undivided attention. Viewers were told to treat games as appointment television. Coverage framed the sport as essential viewing, culturally significant, and historically important. The messaging was relentless. If you weren't watching, you were framed as part of the problem. But for most people, that framing never matched reality. Games were often on in the background, if at all. They competed not with major sporting events, but with remote controls, streaming menus, and casual indifference. For many viewers, women's basketball functioned less as must-watch entertainment and more as optional programming. That gap between how the sport was presented and how it was actually consumed created a fragile illusion. As long as no one acknowledged it, the narrative held. But once performance metrics failed to align with the messaging, the illusion became unsustainable. Media outlets now find themselves in an awkward position. They spent years telling audiences how they should feel instead of paying attention to how audiences actually behaved. That disconnect eroded trust. And now, rather than confronting that history directly, the media is pivoting, quietly rewriting the story. The tone is shifting from obligation to observation, from promotion to analysis. This isn't growth, it's correction. The uncomfortable reality is that no amount of moral framing can force organic interest. Sports succeed because people choose them, not because they're instructed to support them. When coverage leans too heavily into advocacy, it risks alienating casual viewers instead of attracting them. That's the reckoning happening now. The media is slowly admitting that attention can't be demanded, it has to be earned.
Concerningly, with second-year ratings on TNT were lackluster. Unrivaled's opening slate on January the 5th, which kicked off with a Monday afternoon game, averaged 175k viewers in the first two games to air on both TNT and True TV. So basically, they averaged 175k airing on two channels. Airing on two channels at the same time. That's not good. The two True TV exclusive games on January 5th averaged 32,000.
For decades, mainstream sports media positioned itself as the loudest and most loyal defender of women's basketball. Whenever critics questioned the league's sustainability or financial health, media outlets rushed in to shut those conversations down. Doubt was framed as hostility. Skepticism was labeled ignorance. The narrative was tightly controlled, built around the idea that women's basketball was constantly on the brink of a massive breakthrough and simply needed unwavering public support to get there. That protective instinct wasn't subtle. Media coverage often functioned less like analysis and more like advocacy. Struggles were minimized. Warning signs were ignored. Any discussion of poor attendance, weak television ratings, or financial instability was treated as taboo. The unspoken rule was clear. You defend the league at all costs. But now, something extraordinary is happening in real time. That same media ecosystem, the one that once acted as a shield, is suddenly cracking. Prominent voices who spent years promoting women's basketball with near-religious intensity are now openly admitting that Unrivaled is in serious trouble. And they're not whispering it off the record. They're saying it publicly, on camera, in print, in podcasts. The shift is visible, undeniable, and deeply revealing. This is not a minor course correction. It's a dramatic reversal. So the obvious question becomes, what changed? Why are the most vocal supporters suddenly raising alarms instead of offering cover? Why is the code of silence breaking now, after years of rigid message control? The answer isn't sudden honesty or spontaneous commitment to truth. It's pressure. Reality has reached a point where it can no longer be spun away. The numbers are too weak, the gaps too visible, the contrast between narrative and reality too extreme to ignore. Media outlets operate within systems of incentives. For years, protecting women's basketball aligned with cultural trends, institutional priorities, and corporate branding strategies. Supporting the league was framed as progressive, forward-thinking, and morally correct. Questioning it was framed as regressive. But when evidence becomes overwhelming, even the most loyal defenders have to adjust, or risk losing credibility entirely. What we're witnessing now is not media betrayal. It's media self-preservation. By slowly acknowledging unrivaled struggles, these outlets are repositioning themselves. They're signaling that they're aware of reality and capable of critique, without fully admitting their own role in creating unrealistic expectations in the first place. This sudden about-face exposes uncomfortable truths about sports media politics. It reveals how narratives are manufactured, protected, and abandoned when they become too costly to maintain. And it raises a much bigger question. If the media was willing to suppress obvious problems for years, what else has been misrepresented in the name of optics? The unraveling isn't subtle anymore. It's happening in plain sight. And once that kind of shift begins, it rarely stops at just one project.
Nobody's watching it. Nobody's talking about it. I don't understand what's going on. It seems as though a lot of this conflict of interest stuff is coming out more and more, with the co-founders of Unrivaled also being on the board of the WNBA, not getting a deal done, that benefiting Unrivaled, all of these things. But Breanna Stewart had to address the opening week ratings for Unrivaled.
At this point, there's no reason to sugarcoat the situation or manufacture artificial drama. The numbers speak clearly, and they are deeply uncomfortable. Attendance is low. Television ratings are underwhelming. In some cases, they aren't even reaching conservative internal projections. The gap between expectation and reality is no longer debatable, it's measurable. One of the most revealing aspects of Unrivaled struggle is the disconnect between online presence and real-world engagement. On social media, the league appears vibrant. Clips go viral. Hashtags trend. Influencers speak enthusiastically about cultural impact and momentum. But that digital energy simply isn't translating into physical attendance or sustained viewership. Walk into the arenas and the illusion collapses. Large sections of seats remain empty. Crowd energy feels muted. The atmosphere lacks the urgency and electricity that define truly successful sports products. That contrast between what's portrayed online and what exists in reality is jarring, and it's impossible to ignore once you see it firsthand. This isn't a new phenomenon in sports, but it's especially pronounced here. Social media engagement can be inflated through algorithms, coordinated promotion, and selective amplification. But ticket sales and Nielsen ratings don't lie. They reflect genuine consumer behavior, people choosing to spend their time and money. The uncomfortable truth is that interest levels simply aren't there at the scale required to sustain the grand vision that was sold. Unrivaled was marketed as a cultural movement, not just a sports league. Expectations were sky high. The product was framed as revolutionary. And yet, the fundamental metrics that determine viability tell a very different story. This isn't about bad luck or poor timing. It's about overestimation. The belief that online enthusiasm would automatically convert into mass market demand turned out to be flawed. Digital buzz created the appearance of popularity without the substance needed to support it long term. What makes this particularly striking is how long these warning signs were ignored. Declining numbers were explained away. Sparse crowds were reframed as growth opportunities. Every underperformance was positioned as a stepping stone rather than a red flag. But eventually, arithmetic wins. You can't build a sustainable league on vibes, hashtags, and curated optimism. Reality demands consistency, scale, and actual consumer buy-in. Now that the math is impossible to dodge, the tone is changing. The conversation is becoming more cautious, more reserved, less celebratory. And that shift alone tells you everything you need to know.